Mom took her own life following Dad's proposal to his new partner, unable to bear the heartbreak. I'm 14 years old, and up until a short while ago, life was, just a regular kind of normal. I had my two brothers, Matt, who's a couple of years older at 17 and already acting all grown up sometimes, and Luke, the cheeky 15-year-old who always managed to crack a joke at the perfect, or sometimes not so perfect moment. We were your typical family, with our daily routines and small squabbles. There were evenings when we'd all be sprawled out in the living room, fighting over who got to hold the TV remote control, each of us desperate to watch our favorite shows. And then there were those dinner times filled with laughter, as we shared stories from our day at school or work, Mom and Dad listening intently, chiming in with their own tales. But then, out of nowhere, it all just came crashing down like a house of cards. One evening, the atmosphere in our home was different. It was like a storm was brewing, but instead of rain and thunder outside, it was all happening inside our living room. Mom and Dad called us in, and as we walked in, I could practically cut the tension with a knife. Their faces were solemn, and I knew, deep down, that whatever they were about to say was going to turn our lives upside down. Dad cleared his throat, a nervous habit of his that I'd come to recognize over the years. And then he said those words that hit me like a ton of bricks. "Your mom and I are getting a divorce." It was as if time stood still for a moment, and then my heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The room seemed to spin around me, and before I could even begin to make sense of it all, tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. Things took an even darker turn when Dad introduced us to his new girlfriend, Claire. She showed up at our house one day, and it was like she didn't belong there. Yet Dad was acting as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It was painfully obvious that they'd been seeing each other long before the divorce was even mentioned. I mean, the way they exchanged glances, those little knowing smiles and the hushed whispers that seemed to hold a whole world of secrets. It was all just too much to bear. My oldest brother, Matt, he's always been the one to look out for us, like a guardian angel in a way. He has this protective streak a mile wide, and seeing Claire there, he just couldn't hold back. He stepped forward, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and disbelief, and started grilling her. At first, she tried to dodge his questions, but Matt was relentless. And finally, she caved, in a small, almost inaudible voice. She admitted that she'd been involved with Dad for a whole year before the divorce. I felt a rage boiling up inside me like I'd never known before. How could he do this to Mom? Mom, who had always been there for us, through scraped knees and bad grades, late-night fevers and early morning soccer practices. How could he do this to us, shattering the family we knew and loved? In the days that followed, I knew we were faced with a choice, even though it felt so wrong. My brothers and I didn't even have to talk about it. We were united as one. We told Mom over and over again, in whispers and hugs and shared tears, that we were on her side, that we'd be her rock through whatever came her way. And we truly meant it. When we were at her place, which became our safe haven away from the chaos, we went all out to try and make her days a little bit brighter. Every morning, we'd drag ourselves out of bed way earlier than we needed to, just so we could make her favorite breakfast. Mom had a weakness for pancakes, especially those loaded with extra chocolate chips, and we made sure to get the recipe just right, flipping them on the griddle until they were golden brown and perfect. In the evenings, after a long day at school or work, we'd all huddle up on the couch with her, for hours on end. Sometimes we'd talk about the big things, like what we wanted to be when we grew up, or how we thought the world could be a better place. Other times, we'd just chat about the little things, like the funny dog we saw on the street or the new song that was stuck in our heads. We watched those cheesy rom-coms she adored, the ones with the predictable plots and over-the-top love scenes. I'd roll my eyes at some of the corny lines, but seeing her face light up with laughter made it all worth it. Matt, he was truly amazing. He took it upon himself to make Mom's commute a little easier. He'd set his alarm for 2 hours earlier than his usual wake-up time, just so he could drive her to work. I remember those early mornings, seeing him stumble out of bed, still half asleep, but with a determined look on his face. He didn't want Mom to have to deal with the hustle and bustle of the subway like she always did, squeezing into crowded carriages, being jostled around by strangers, and having to listen to the screeching of the train on the tracks. And me, when I was at Dad's for the weekend, supposedly doing my homework, but really just trying to escape the reality for a bit, I'd always have my phone propped up on my desk, FaceTiming Mom. We wouldn't even have to say much. Sometimes we'd just sit there in silence, her working on something at her end, and me scribbling away at my math problems. But just seeing her face on the screen, those familiar eyes and the warm smile that still managed to peek through the sadness, made me feel closer to her than ever. But then, Dad dropped another bombshell that seemed to obliterate whatever shred of hope or normalcy we were clinging to. He told us he was planning to marry Claire. I literally couldn't believe my ears. It was like he was taking a knife and twisting it deeper into the wound that was already bleeding profusely. He had a long, drawn-out call with Mom, and I could hear her muffled sobs from the other room. It was the sound of a heart breaking, and it tore me apart. The next day at school, I was like a zombie. I walked the hallways in a daze, bumping into lockers and classmates without even realizing it. I couldn't focus on my classes, my mind constantly drifting back to the nightmare that our home had become. And then we got called into the principal's office. Dad was there, looking haggard and defeated, his face as pale as a ghost, and his eyes bloodshot and red. He told us that Mom had committed suicide. In that moment, it was like the ground beneath my feet opened up and swallowed me whole. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My whole world, which had just started to crumble, now lay in ruins. It was the end of everything I knew, and I had no idea how to pick up the pieces. The days following Mom's death were a blur of pain and disbelief. I felt like I was walking through a thick fog, unable to see where I was going or what the future held. Everywhere I looked, there were reminders of her. Her favorite mug still sat on the kitchen counter, the one with the faded flowers that she always used for her morning coffee. I'd pick it up sometimes, running my fingers over the chipped rim, and tears would spring to my eyes as I remembered how she'd smile at me over the brim as we shared breakfast. School became a nightmare. I couldn't concentrate on anything. Teachers would call my name, and I'd snap out of my daze, realizing I hadn't heard a word they'd said. My grades started to slip, and I didn't even care. What was the point of worrying about math equations or history dates when my whole world had fallen apart? Luke was having a tough time too. He stopped cracking his usual jokes and would often sit in silence, staring off into space. Matt, who was usually so strong, seemed to be crumbling on the inside. I could see it in his eyes, the pain and the guilt, like he thought he should have been able to protect Mom somehow. Claire, that woman, was still around. She was trying to act all nice, like she actually cared about us. But every time I saw her, I wanted to scream. She was the reason our family was broken. She'd waltzed into our lives and torn it apart. And now she was pretending like everything was okay. She never even mentioned Mom, as if she'd never existed. It was like she was erasing her from our lives. And I couldn't stand it. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the anger boiled over. I got up, my fists clenched, and stormed into the living room where Dad and Claire were sitting. I stood there, trembling with rage, and yelled, "How could you? How could you do this to us? Mom's gone because of you." Dad looked up, his eyes filled with shock and sadness. He tried to say something, but I didn't give him a chance. I turned and ran back to my room, slamming the door behind me. I collapsed on my bed, sobbing uncontrollably. I knew yelling at them wouldn't bring Mom back, but I couldn't keep it all bottled up inside. A few days later, we found out about the teen support group. One of my school counselors, Ms. Jenkins, pulled me aside after class. She had this kind, gentle look in her eyes, and she said, "I know things are really tough right now. There's a support group for teens who've been through similar situations. It might help you to talk to others who understand what you're going through." I was skeptical at first. I didn't want to talk to strangers about my pain, but then I thought about how I was feeling, and I realized I needed something, anything, to help me get through this. So, I convinced Matt and Luke to come with me. The first meeting was held in a small community center. When we walked in, I was nervous. There were a bunch of other kids our age, all looking as lost and broken as we were. We sat down in a circle, and one by one, people started sharing their stories. There was a girl whose father had died in a car accident, and a boy whose mom had lost her battle with cancer. Hearing their stories made me realize that we weren't alone. There were others out there who knew what it was like to lose someone they loved, even if the circumstances were different. After the meeting, I felt a tiny bit better. It was like a weight had been lifted, just a little. I knew we still had a long way to go, but at least I had hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. But then, when we got home, Dad dropped another piece of news. He said he and Claire were still planning to get married. I couldn't believe it. After everything that had happened, how could he be so heartless? It was like he didn't care about our feelings at all. That night, after Dad's announcement, I lay awake, my mind racing with a million angry thoughts. How could he be so oblivious to our pain? Mom had only been gone a couple of weeks, and it felt like he was already erasing her memory, replacing it with this new life that we didn't want any part of. I tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around my legs as I wrestled with my emotions. In the morning, the atmosphere at home was even more suffocating. Claire flitted around the kitchen, trying to act normal, making breakfast as if nothing was wrong. But every time she moved, it grated on my nerves. I glared at her, my eyes shooting daggers, but she pretended not to notice. Matt and Luke were just as quiet, the usual morning banter completely absent. We ate our cereal in silence, the only sound being the clinking of spoons against bowls. At school, I couldn't focus any better than the day before. My friends tried to cheer me up, but their words fell flat. How could they understand what I was going through? They still had their intact families, their parents who loved each other and were there for them. I felt like an outsider, looking in on a world that I no longer belonged to. During lunch break, I found a quiet corner in the schoolyard and sat down, my head in my hands. I thought about Mom, about all the things we'd never get to do together again. We planned a trip to the beach that summer, and now it was just a distant, painful memory. I started to cry, silent tears streaming down my face. I didn't care if anyone saw me. I was too consumed by my grief. Back home, things went from bad to worse. Dad tried to have a conversation with us, but it quickly devolved into an argument. He said he understood we were hurting, but he thought Claire could be a positive influence in our lives. I scoffed at that. Positive influence? She's the reason Mom's gone. I shouted, my voice cracking with emotion. Matt chimed in, his voice filled with anger. How can you expect us to just accept her? We loved Mom, and you betrayed her. Dad hung his head, looking defeated, but he didn't back down. He said the wedding was still going to happen. We decided we'd had enough. Matt called our cousin, Sarah, who lived in the same city. She'd always been close to our family, and we knew she'd be on our side. We told her everything that had happened, and she was horrified. She immediately offered to help in any way she could. She said we could come over after school, stay for dinner, and talk about our problems. It was a glimmer of hope in the darkness. That evening, we went to Sarah's. As soon as we walked in the door, she pulled us into a tight hug. We broke down in her arms, all the pent-up emotions of the past few weeks spilling out. She listened, stroking our hair and whispering words of comfort. Over dinner, we talked about our options. She suggested that maybe we could look into legal guardianship if we didn't want to stay with Dad and Claire. It was a scary thought, but at that moment, it seemed like the only way out. We left Sarah's feeling a bit more empowered, but still incredibly sad. When we got home, Dad and Claire were waiting for us. Claire asked if we could talk. I was hesitant, but I agreed. She sat us down and said she knew we hated her, and she didn't blame us. She said she'd been having a really hard time too, that she felt personally responsible for Mom's suicide. She started to cry, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered Mom, and the anger came rushing back. She said if we wanted, she would leave Dad and us if it would help us heal. I didn't know what to say. I looked at Matt and Luke, and we were all at a loss for words. In the end, we didn't give her an answer. We just went to our rooms, our heads spinning with even more confusion. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache, the result of another restless night. As I trudged to the bathroom, I could hear hushed voices coming from the kitchen. I paused for a moment, straining to listen. It was Dad and Claire, and they were arguing. I don't know what to do anymore, Claire, Dad said, his voice weary. The kids hate you, and I can't blame them. But I love you, and I thought we could make this work. Claire sniffled. I know it's my fault. I never meant for any of this to happen. Maybe I should just go like I said. It's tearing us all apart. I didn't wait to hear more. I quickly washed up and got ready for school, my mind reeling. Was Claire actually going to leave? Part of me hoped she would, but another part felt a strange pang of guilt. After all, she seemed genuinely remorseful. At school, I couldn't shake off the conversation I'd overheard. It was like a background noise in my head, drowning out the teachers' voices. During our class, I found myself absent-mindedly doodling a picture of our family before all this chaos. There was Mom, her smile bright as always, Dad with his arm around her, and the three of us boys huddled close. Looking at it, my eyes welled up with tears, and I quickly crumpled it up and shoved it in my backpack. When we got home that afternoon, the house was eerily quiet. Claire's things were still there, but she was nowhere to be seen. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. Where's Claire? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad looked up, his eyes red. She left. She said she needed to give us some space. I don't know if she'll be back. I didn't know how to feel. Relief? Sadness? Confusion? It was all jumbled up inside me. Matt and Luke came home shortly after, and we had a silent dinner. The emptiness at the table where Claire usually sat was glaringly obvious. A few days later, we went back to the teen support group. This time, I was more open. I shared our story about how Dad was still planning to marry Claire even after Mom's death, and how she had left. The other kids listened, their eyes filled with empathy. One girl, whose mother had passed away from illness, said, "My dad did some stupid things too after Mom died. He was just lost. Maybe your dad will come to his senses." Her words gave me a glimmer of hope. Back at home, Dad tried to reach out to us. He suggested we go bowling, like we used to on weekends. I was hesitant, but Matt and Luke agreed. As we walked into the bowling alley, the familiar smell of fried food and shoe polish hit me. For a moment, I forgot about all the pain and just focused on knocking down those pins. Dad tried to make conversation, asking about school and our friends. It was awkward, but it was a start. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the day. Maybe there was a chance for Dad to change. Maybe we could find a way to heal as a family. But then I remembered Mom and the hole in my heart that she left. Could we ever really fill it? The question swirled in my head as I drifted off to sleep, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. The next morning, I woke up with a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in weeks, a bit of hope. Maybe it was the bowling trip with Dad, as awkward as it had been. Or perhaps it was the words of that girl at the support group, echoing in my mind. Whatever it was, I decided to try and meet Dad halfway. When I walked into the kitchen, Dad was already there, making pancakes. It was a small thing, but it reminded me of all the times Mom used to do the same when we were younger. I took a deep breath and said, "Morning, Dad." He looked up, a bit startled, as if he hadn't expected me to initiate the conversation. "Morning, son," he replied, a tentative smile on his face. "I thought you boys might like some pancakes. Your favorite, with chocolate chips." I nodded and sat down at the table. Matt and Luke joined us a few minutes later, and we ate in relative silence, but it was a more comfortable silence than before. After breakfast, Dad cleared his throat and said, "I know things have been really tough, and I'm sorry. I've been thinking a lot, and I want to make things right. I called your cousin Sarah." My ears perked up. Sarah had been our rock during this whole mess. "What did she say?" I asked. Dad sighed. "She said we should all sit down and have a long talk. Figure out what's best for you boys." I agree. So, I invited her over tonight. That evening, when Sarah arrived, the atmosphere was tense, but filled with a sense of anticipation. We all gathered in the living room, and Dad started. "I love you boys more than anything. I know I messed up big time. I should have been more sensitive to your feelings after Mom passed away, and I shouldn't have rushed into things with Claire." Sarah nodded. "It's been a difficult time for everyone, but the important thing now is to focus on the kids." "What do you want to happen?" she asked, looking at us. Matt spoke up first. "We don't want to lose you, Dad, but we also can't forget Mom. And we don't know if we can accept Claire, at least not right now." I chimed in. "We just want things to go back to how they were, but we know that's not possible. We need time to heal." Dad listened intently, his eyes filled with regret. "I understand. I'm going to put the wedding on hold. For as long as you need. I want to focus on us, on rebuilding our family." It was a huge relief to hear those words. Maybe we could actually find a way forward. Over the next few weeks, Dad made a real effort. He started going to counseling himself to deal with his grief and the guilt he was feeling. He spent more time with us, helping with homework, playing video games, and just talking. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of sadness and anger, but we were slowly mending the broken pieces. One day, out of the blue, I got a text from Claire. She said she was thinking about us and hoped we were okay. She also said she was getting some help too, to understand how her actions had affected us. I didn't reply right away. I wasn't sure how I felt about her yet, but it was another sign that things were changing. As the months passed, the pain of Mom's loss was still there, but it didn't feel as raw. We were learning to live with it and with each other. Dad was becoming the father we remembered, and we were finding our way back to a new kind of normal. There would always be a mom-shaped hole in our hearts, but we knew she would have wanted us to be happy. And for the first time in a long while, I truly believe that we could be.